For the last 22 years, I've been living in two worlds. On any given day, you'll find me happily teaching classes on Shakespeare and the great books of the Western canon. But it's equally likely on any given day that you will find me teaching classes and directing research in the field of gender-based violence. I have to laugh when I look at my office bookshelf. On one side, what my students call the dead white guy side, we have Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, Plato. And on the other side are books on feminist intersectional theory, the latest interventions for trauma. So Plato meets PTSD, Shakespeare meets sexual harassment. And of course, when I do think of these things seriously, the two sides are connected. The world that Plato and Homer gave us is exactly the world where we need to talk about gender-based violence, a world where violence, and especially violence against women, is a cultural norm for us. So I want to tell you a few things about how far we've come in this field of gender-based violence and where we still need to go. The good news is we've come a long way in our understanding of issues like domestic violence, rape, sexual harassment, stalking, these behaviors that we now call gender-based violence. 45 years ago, there wasn't even a word for domestic violence. There wasn't a legal category for sexual harassment. We didn't have a true understanding of the real dangers of stalking. And there were basically no organized efforts to help with the widespread problem of sexual assault. Today, we routinely hear about these things in the media. We have thousands of nonprofit organizations devoted to helping survivors of violence. And we have many, many more laws designed to hold perpetrators accountable, things that would have been unimaginable in 1970 when the modern movements against rape and domestic violence were just getting started in the United States. That's the good news. The not so good news is that in spite of all of this awareness, in spite of all this energy, we have still not solved this problem of gender-based violence. When I started as a volunteer back in Indiana in 1994 in a rape crisis center and domestic violence shelter, we were talking about numbers like 1 in 3 women being affected by domestic violence over the course of a lifetime. We were talking about 1 in 4 college-age women having experienced rape or attempted rape since age 14. And even after all this energy and devotion to this issue, these are still the statistics, very close to the statistics that we talk about in my college classroom over 20 years later. We are still talking about 1 in 4 women being affected by intimate partner violence in a lifetime. We are still talking about 1 in 5 college women being assaulted. There is still a lot of work to do. And this enormous problem of gender-based violence, I think from my perspective, the biggest challenge that we have before us is to focus honestly and imaginatively on prevention, what prevention really looks like and what it really means. And I say this because so often in our daily lives when we talk about practicing violence prevention, what we're doing isn't really prevention at all. I want to share with you an exercise that I do with my class on gender violence at Washington University. On the first day of class, I ask my students 2 questions. The first question is, before coming to college, what advice had you been given about avoiding being sexually assaulted? And the second question is, what do you do? What actions do you take, large or small, on a daily basis to avoid being sexually assaulted? And the last time I did this exercise, I did it with a group of 45 or 50 students of all genders between the ages of 18 and 22, and a pretty privileged bunch on the whole. And this is what the list looked like. Actually, this is what part of the list looked like. It was much longer. This list ranges from everything, from personal grooming, don't wear ponytails, don't wear sexy or revealing clothing, to very specific instructions about how to get to and from your cars and parking lots, how to carry your cell phone, mace, pepper spray, whistle, weapons, how to get to and from places, who to talk to, who never to talk to, what apartments to get, what pets to get, how to carry special nail polish, coasters, swizzle sticks, to test your drinks for date rape drugs, how to avoid white vans, and so on and so on and so on. This list makes me worry. And after 15 years of asking these questions, I've begun to notice some patterns. The first thing that I've noticed is that semester after semester, it's the women in the class who generate the list and who most understand it. Now, the men in the class are generally worried, concerned, compassionate, listening. But when I ask them the same question, what advice had you been given to avoid sexual assault? Most of them look at me and say, no one's ever talked to me about that. So what I've learned is, in this exercise, is that it's still the job, according to our culture, for women and girls to make sure that rape doesn't happen. And it's not that men don't get raped, believe me, they do. But they don't seem to live in a world where every day they're preparing for its inevitability. The second thing that I've noticed about this list is that when we are prepared to talk about sexual assault, what we're often talking about is stranger rape. This list, you would read it and say that a rapist is somebody who jumps out from behind bushes in dark places. And while this kind of assault does happen, the vast majority of assaults are committed by acquaintances, people we already know. And on college campuses like mine, this is above 90%. So if we're looking to this list for safety, we're looking in the wrong places. Another thing that I noticed about the list is how illogical and contradictory it is. It's a lot of rules. And it quickly becomes apparent that it's absolutely impossible to pay attention to all the rules all at the same time. Some of them just contradict one another. Always talk on a cell phone while walking alone in a strange area. Never talk on a cell phone while walking alone in a strange area. Avoid apartments on the first floor. Avoid apartments where you have to use stairs or elevators. It's absolutely illogical. Another thing that I've started to notice is how double-edged this advice is, that taken together, these create a lot of rules about what women should do, and especially about what they shouldn't do. It starts to become a kind of social control for women and quietly dictating behavior. And even worse, it gives us the language of judgment when something does go wrong. After all, if somebody is assaulted, often the first words out of people's mouths come straight from the assumption that someone could have avoided harm, could have avoided being hurt. Where were you? What were you doing? Were you drinking? So what we start to see is that this very well-meaning advice isn't really prevention at all. At best, it's a form of risk reduction, things we might do to lessen our chances of being hurt. But deep down, we know that it doesn't guarantee our safety. And deep down, we know that if we want to tackle this problem of violence, we have got to get to the perpetrators of the violence and the social norms that give those people permission and protection. I have a feeling that because prevention seems like such a huge and daunting task, that we've resorted to dealing with what we think we can control, the victims. Unfortunately, this strategy ends up backfiring, because in trying to free people from the threat of violence, we manage to imprison them in a whole different set of unreasonable expectations. And then, when something does happen, we tell them it's their fault when they get hurt. We have to get creative about prevention. We have to get imaginative. A mentor of mine loves to tell the story of the babies in the river. It goes something like this. One day, villagers were going about their daily business when one of them spotted a baby floating down a nearby river. The villagers yelled for help. Someone dove in, got the baby, brought the baby to safety. A little while later, 2 more babies were floating down the river. The villagers once again dove in the water, got the baby out of the river, both babies, and brought them to safety. Soon, however, more and more babies started floating down the river. Now, the villagers set up a system. They set up a human chain to get the babies out of the water and into safety and to care. Several hours into their baby-saving efforts, one of the villagers started to walk away. "What are you doing?" they yelled at her. "Can't you see? We have all these babies. They keep coming faster and faster. We need to get them out of the water." And the villager who had begun to walk away from the river shouted back, Yes, I see. Keep going. But I'm going to go upstream and see who's throwing those babies into the river. And I'm going to stop them." Right? So this parable begins to get at some of the important distinctions between responding to a crisis after the fact and preventing the crisis from happening in the first place. Here in the United States, we are doing better all the time at responding to violence. We have rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, transitional housing, specialized domestic violence courts, evidence-based trauma interventions, better training for police, and on and on and on. But we are not all that imaginative and comprehensive about what prevention should look like. We have got to start thinking upstream. There are some upstream steps that we can take. The first one is that we need to start challenging some pretty dangerous gender norms in our society. One of the things that Jackson Katz has reminded us of rightly is that we need to focus on the gender part of gender-based violence. We need to challenge the deeply entrenched connections in our society between masculinity and violence, the social norms that allow us to continue to treat girls and women like possessions, objects, sexual objects, rather than full human beings, the kinds of norms that go way back to Homer and way back to Plato. We also need to start challenging the connection between sex and violence in our culture. I mean, can you think of a slang term for sex that doesn't have a violent connotation? These connections between masculinity and violence and sex and violence are what blind us to the norms around us, blind us that this stuff has become normal. And we need to start questioning where those norms are coming from in our education, in our media, how we keep communicating to young men that they need to aspire to a kind of masculinity that's the opposite of femininity, that they need to reject anything remotely feminine, things that threaten to undermine actual relationships with true human women as equals. The second thing, there's evidence to suggest that we need to be looking at childhood. Solving for child abuse and childhood trauma and fostering physical and psychological health in children can go a long way towards solving problems in adulthood. Child abuse, we know, creates vulnerabilities in some children that enable them to go on to commit violence later in their lives. And it creates vulnerabilities in other children that allow them to be susceptible to other people's violence. Bessel van der Kolk, a leader in the field, has recently reminded us that if we were to solve for child abuse in America, we would reduce domestic violence by 3/4. And we would go a long way towards solving other problems as well. We need to be looking in these areas. Third, we need to stop thinking about violence as private and as individual as our default. When we individualize it, when we give people advice and tell them to take self-defense classes, we're forgetting to look at these larger systems that set up choices and inequality for people in their worlds. We forget to intervene on things like poverty and lack of education, two crucial risk factors that make people extra vulnerable to violence. And when we individualize it and start telling the women in our lives how to be safer, we also fail to notice and interrogate the violence that is happening to men and transgender people in our society. Men account for 9% of sexual assault survivors, a number that is almost certainly underreported. And transgender folks experience violence at much, much higher rates than anybody in the country, levels of violence we're only beginning to understand. My challenge to you would be this: join the growing number of efforts focused on primary prevention, getting to the violence before it happens, talking to teens about healthy relationships, creating cultural norms that allow us to have these conversations, talking openly and honestly about sex and consent, joining a bystander intervention program, talking to people of all ages, and especially children, about healthy and authentic ways to name, manage, and express their full range of emotions so that anger isn't the only socially acceptable emotion that men are allowed to feel. And every time you find yourself giving a piece of advice to someone about how to have violence avoided, also think of a tangible and specific thing that you could do to make that particular piece of advice a little less necessary in the world. So the next time you try to send someone off to college with mace or pepper spray, also think of a way you could contribute to primary prevention on that campus, a way that you could make sure that there are fewer perpetrators of violence. What would a college campus or a larger community look like with fewer people perpetrating violence in the first place? What is one step that we can take? And that step is going to look different for everyone, depending on where you are and who you are. But we have got to start thinking upstream about this issue. Whatever you decide to do, we have got to move from our well-intentioned advice to action and well-intentioned prevention and action. I want to live in a world where the only gender violence I see is in the books on my bookshelf. Thank you.